Well, thank you very much, and thank you for still staying with us as we go through this marathon session discussing the Nuclear Posture Review. I am Deepti Chobe. I'm the Deputy Director of the Nuclear Policy Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And today's session is about the views from non-nuclear weapon states. And it was interesting that earlier Gary Seymour had identified for us the foreign audiences the NPR attempted to target, and that non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT, including those that are part of the non-aligned movement, were second most important in their priorities. And as many capitals continue to formulate their views about the NPR, this session aims to begin a discussion of likely responses from key non-nuclear weapon states. And I hope that after we hear from our speakers that we can have an active conversation with you, the audience, and any views that you might have or any predictions. So to set some context for this discussion, we have to acknowledge that we will hear many of these views when the 2010 NPT Review Conference convenes in New York in less than 2 weeks. And it will be one moment where the rest of the world will judge the United States' commitment to disarmament and where they will refer back to the NPR as proof. So we do know, for one thing, that the NPR is widely read. Even the non-aligned movement referred to it when it reiterated in the final statement of its July 2009 summit that it had concerns about proposals around new nuclear weapons, and it actually explicitly refers to previous nuclear posture reviews. We also know that even friendly states refer to the nuclear posture review and concerns about what would have been in it, and this is particularly over the last few years. One thing, though, that I want to note is that in the 13 steps that were agreed to at the 2000 NPT Review Conference, one of those steps was for nuclear weapon states to decrease their reliance and the salience of nuclear weapons in their national security policies. And I think the Nuclear Posture Review, has very explicitly acknowledged that that is what the United States is aiming to do. And for the first time in Nuclear Posture Review history, it also explicitly acknowledges the United States' NPT commitments and specifically Article 6. I, for one, was very heartened to see that. It was something that I advocated for, and I hope that it'll pay off in some ways for the United States in the upcoming discussions. So I think in many ways, the Nuclear Posture Review will be the bellwether of U.S. nuclear intentions for many states in the conversation to come. So two key questions is, has the U.S. done enough to overcome its credibility problem with skeptical non-nuclear weapon states? And can we expect any of these states to modify their positions or to search constructively for common ground at the upcoming review conference? And the early word from UN General Assembly debate 2 days ago, entitled Disarmament and World Security, is that positions, particularly from critical non-aligned movement countries, may be hardening in advance of the conference. And I think we'll have to figure out, is this just a negotiating tactic, or are these really positions in the long term? And specifically, Algeria, Egypt, Kuwait, Libya, and Syria declared their opposition to a series of U.S.-backed measures, including proposals that are designed to rein in nuclear proliferators like North Korea and Iran by strengthening scrutiny of nuclear energy programs, proposals to punish countries that withdraw from the NPT. They criticized also the plans to create a fuel bank, and they also expressed their serious concerns about UN Security Council Resolution 1887. This is the Article 6 non-binding resolution that President Obama secured unanimous support for when he chaired the UN Security Council last September. And as many of you may know, Egypt is currently the chair of the non-aligned movement, and its UN ambassador Abdelaziz publicly stated that there is mistrust. And he repeated the mantra that nuclear weapon states are trying to impose new demands on non-nuclear weapon states while nuclear weapon states fail to live up to their own disarmament obligations. And he also referred to the damage of the U.S.-India deal, or the NSG-India deal, however you want to talk about it, in terms of, again, a sense of inequity from non-nuclear weapon states about what's happening more broadly in the non-proliferation regime. So that gives us some sense of the non-aligned movement's current thinking, although we should be careful in thinking about the non-aligned movement monolithically. There are, 118 members. There are a variety of views, and I think it'll be interesting to see how those views are expressed in the month ahead. Unfortunately, Ambassador Bali from Algeria could not be with us today, but we are thankfully joined by Orlando Ribeiro from the Brazilian Embassy and Peter Sofchak from the Australian Embassy. Orlando will share with us Brazil's perspective, and without a doubt, Brazil is a key player in the non-proliferation regime, and mostly because, actually for many reasons, but one reason is that Brazil has a lot of really key relationships and actually serves as an observer in the non-aligned movement. And just a word about Orlando's background. He is the counselor for non-proliferation and disarmament at the embassy and has served in Washington since 2008. And prior to Washington, he held posts at the Brazilian Government Trade Bureau in New York and at the Brazilian Embassy to Paraguay. And Peter is with us today to share views from the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. This was an effort led by the Australian and Japanese governments and represents, I think, a global undertaking of experts and former practitioners from a diverse group of countries. Peter has been political counselor at the Embassy of Australia to Washington since August of 2008. And prior to this, he served as counselor at the Australian Mission in Brussels and was director of counterproliferation at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, during which time he oversaw publication of a major government policy paper, which was titled Australia's Role in Fighting Proliferation. He has also been posted to Australia's embassy in Moscow and worked as an advisor on defense, security, and security issues for the Prime Minister. So we're honored to have these two great people who will, I think, lay an excellent foundation for the conversation to come. So why don't I hand it over first to Orlando, and then we will hear from Peter. And I'm sorry, I realize you guys are both on other sides of me. So my hand motions just reverse them from me.
Well, thank you for having me here. Well, I would like to begin by saying that the views I expressed today are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of my government. Well, the Nuclear Posture Review, the New START Agreement, and the Nuclear Security Summit will certainly have a positive impact in the NPT review conference in New York next month. Yet the key question is whether or not these genuine achievements will be enough to convince most countries, especially the non-nuclear weapon states, that sufficient progress toward disarmament has now been made by the United States as is required by Article 6 of the NPT. President Obama announced a truly ambitious agenda last year in Prague. Probably the most ambitious agenda on non-proliferation and disarmament ever announced by a US president, or for the matter, by any president. 1 year ago, one might believe that the US would come to the NPT review conference having, among other things, ratified the CTBT and a new and ambitious START agreement. Well, it has now become clear that the Obama administration might not be able to accomplish these goals for reasons that you all know, and so I'll not address them here. But there is a lot one can say regarding the new nuclear posture review. I'll try to keep my comments on the nuclear posture review brief, since it has already been addressed by previous panelists. Well, for once, the nuclear posture review is certainly better than the two previous ones, even though it still suggests that the United States will continue to rely on nuclear weapons to a significant degree and for the foreseeable future. Well, here I'll stress 2 points that I see as positive: the new declaratory policy and the commitment to pursue nuclear disarmament. One of the most important changes introduced by the NPR involved the US declaratory policy regarding the purpose and the use of nuclear weapons. The new policy incorporates, as Mr. Seymour noted, a strengthened negative security assurance. Well, the United States is now committed to not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the NPT and in compliance with their nuclear non-proliferation obligations. Well, the NPR did not go so far as to explicitly renounce the option of first use of nuclear weapons, nor did it make deterrence of nuclear attack the sole purpose of nuclear weapons. However, it significantly restricted the use of nuclear weapons. Well, the NPR, as you all know, declares that the fundamental role of US nuclear weapons the fundamental rule, as was stated twice today, which will continue as long as nuclear weapon exists in the world, is to deter nuclear attacks on the United States, its allies, and partners. Well, the exceptions to this narrower focus will be non-nuclear attacks by any nuclear-armed states or by states that the United States deems to be in violation of the NPT. In this context, Mr. Seymour's statement that Iran is not in compliance with the NPT obligation leads to the conclusion that the US retains the option of first nuclear use against Iran and for similar reasons against North Korea. Well, this is something that should be worked on in the near future in order to increase the chances of a successful outcome for both cases, the Iranian case and the North Korean case. The second point that I find particularly positive is that the NPR also includes, for the first time, the promise that the United States will meet its commitment under Article 6 of the NPT to pursue nuclear disarmament and will make demonstrable progress over the next 5 to 10 years. The proposed time period, 5 to 10 years, represents a flexible timeline for nuclear disarmament and appears to bear an implicit relationship to the timetable of the NPT review conferences. So the language adopted in the NPR may indicate possible flexibility on the part of the US delegation during the next NPT review conference in May 2010. Well, to sum up my views, I think it's fair to say that the NPR is not a huge step. It's not the step that we all wish for, but is a step forward. Well, now let's talk a little bit about the NPT review conference. For Brazil, the NPT remains the cornerstone of a stable global regime of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and is therefore vital for the maintenance of international peace and security. Brazil is against nuclear weapons proliferation because it opposes the very existence of nuclear weapons. And as we all agree, disarmament and non-proliferation are mutually reinforcing. So the lack of significant progress on the part of nuclear weapon states to effectively eliminate their nuclear arsenals renders it increasingly difficult for the international community to seek to maintain the integrity and sustainability of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. So failure to meet the nuclear disarmament obligation stipulated in Article 6 of the NPT undermines the global non-proliferation regime. For as long as some states possess nuclear weapons, others will be tempted to acquire or develop them. 40 years after the entry into force of the NPT, the non-nuclear weapon states, with one notable exception, have kept their commitment not to acquire nuclear weapons. The 5 nuclear weapon states, on the other hand, are still far from living up to their side of the bargain. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil welcomes, as an encouraging sign, the conclusion of the New START agreement. But the United States and Russia will still account together for nearly 90% of all existing nuclear weapons. On the other hand, billions of dollars are spent on military nuclear programs. New nuclear weapons and their delivery systems are being designed. We need to recognize that reducing the stockpiles will not lead to true disarmament as long as qualitative arms race continue. If today we face a crisis within the NPT, it is mainly due to failure to disarm rather than a tendency to proliferate. Any attempt to emphasize the non-proliferation pillar while failing to give equal emphasis to disarmament is an approach that Brazil and many other countries might not accept. The very existence of nuclear weapons diminishes the security of all states. It is often said that as long as nuclear weapons exist, they will continue to spread. The NPT Review Conference would be considered successful, if it emphasized the commitment that all members have to the three pillars, and if it restores the confidence in the authority of the NPT. Achieving consensus around a straightforward document with these main points would be the best possible outcome for the conference. It is important for the review conference to maintain momentum in strongly supporting the principles of disarmament and non-proliferation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Orlando. And Peter now to my right.
I'm not sure that I entirely agree with the title of this heading, for the reason that Deepti mentioned. The non-nuclear weapon states are not a monolithic category. And many, if not most of us, aren't necessarily skeptics in relation to the NPR. So it'd be perhaps useful to start with some terminological clarifications in this respect. Certainly many non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear armed states that are in the NAM in particular have been dismayed about progress on disarmament or the lack thereof by the P5. So it's, for this reason, it's very hard to sort of, as I mentioned, as Deepti mentioned, to regard the non-nuclear weapon states as a monolithic category. Australia, as an example, is a very close ally of the US, but this doesn't prevent us from having a very strong profile on disarmament and non-proliferation. Some of you might recall Deepti's paper on are new nuclear bargains possible, and I think you mentioned in a confidential conversation you had with an Australian diplomat that we, unlike others you spoke to, regularly raise disarmament issues with the US in the course of our strategic level consultations. We've perhaps, and of course, traditionally, historically, Australian Labor governments tend to be at the forefront with a strong emphasis on disarmament. Most recently, we've demonstrated these sorts of credentials through the establishment of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, along with Japan. Among the Commission's many virtues is the fact that it is geographically representative, global, to use our moderator's terminology, in the sense that it also bridges non-nuclear weapon states with nuclear weapon states' views, and then also that it was able to produce a report that lists very pragmatic recommendations that are sensitive to geopolitical realities. The Commission's report has been the subject of extensive outreach by the co-chairs of the Commission as well as commissioners, most stridently by the Australian co-chair Gareth Evans, and it's attracted near universal support among non-nuclear weapon states from what I've been able to see. Some have even suggested that the report provides a very valuable textbook for preparing national delegations for the NPT Review Conference, which is all very flattering, of course. Bearing all this in mind, I'd note that I don't speak for the Commission, of course. The Australian government established the Commission, has supported it financially, but it doesn't, of course, reflect the views of the Australian government or the Japanese government or any government for that matter. But nonetheless, there are very sound reasons for the exercise I propose. I mean, at Deepti's and George's invitation to identify points of convergence and divergence between the ICND report and the NPR. The Commission represents, after all, a significant international constituency. It maps out effectively a middle ground between a realistic an activist agenda that's informed both by expert knowledge from its commissioners and advisory board members, but also it includes past and previous policymakers who have a very close appreciation of diverse national political contexts. So the Commission's report, its unique value resides in the fact that it's what I call the golden mean of the politically tenable rather than the gold standard of the ideally desirable. So as is well known, the US administration that authored the 2010 NPR had a partial blueprint in the form of the Prague speech by President Obama. As is less well known, it also had a process in place for consulting closely with allies. I don't know if partners were involved as well, according to Gary's definition, but this included Australia. The NPR, well, the US administration was very closely informed of the Commission's deliberations and preferences by the ICND co-chairs, and as well as the US Commissioner, former Defense Secretary Perry. So how does the NPR stack up against expectations generated by the Commission? At a SACE-hosted event last week, Gareth Evans in fact characterized the NPR, and I quote him, as a reasonably positive outcome. So I propose to highlight some individual items, going chronologically through a reading of the report, then make some rather more general remarks about the tone and context of both exercises, adding also some Australian perspectives. I'd note on the latter that the Australian Ministers for Foreign Affairs and for Defence issued a 4-page statement welcoming the NPR on the 7th of April, which provides a useful summation of Australia's perspectives on the NPR and what impact it might have on the broader Disarmament Non-Proliferation Agenda. First of all, close referencing in the NPR of President Obama's Prague speech as a new direction for coping with 21st century nuclear dangers provides a point of departure that could only be strongly endorsed by the Commission. In fact, the Commission report glowingly acknowledges the new momentum generated by the Obama administration. This is a very important point, given the need that George Perkovich very usefully highlighted recently, that the challenge now for President Obama is to really carve out a broader international constituency for this agenda. Further afield, nuclear terrorism is not the premier threat identified by the Commission, as it is by the NPR. Rather, conflict between nuclear-armed states, whether they're intentional or accidental, is the main concern of the Commission. Although I'd note here, interestingly, that the Nuclear Security Summit didn't seem to harbour any dissent on nuclear terrorism as being a premier threat. Both reports nonetheless accord high priority to preventing new nuclear-armed states from emerging, most immediately, of course, Iran and the DPRK. The NPR's acknowledgement of Article 6 obligations to strengthen the US case for tightening non-proliferation norms would be most welcomed by the ICNND. The question remains, however, as to how much is enough. I mean, given the high degree of politicization of this issue across north-south lines at NPT review conferences, obviously there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation on disarmament and non-proliferation, which Orlando referred to. This will continue to plague RevCon outcomes, although there is a bit of an effort by the US at the moment to expose the limitations of these sorts of linkages by drawing attention to the third pillar of peaceful uses and highlighting the advantages that NPT-compliant states parties enjoy through increased nuclear technology cooperation. I'd also say on this point, just as an aside, that we have to be very careful about what we do in the NPT review conference context in terms of non-proliferation. It shouldn't be a quid pro quo, obviously. The NPT does highlight non-proliferation, and we're at a very urgent point in terms of preventing new entrants among nuclear-armed states. And this is a dynamic that we'll obviously have to work very hard to address in a way that satisfies both ends of the spectrum politically. The NPR's acknowledgement, in terms of practical disarmament outcomes, the US and Russia have, of course, met a key ICNND short-term action agenda objective by concluding a new START treaty, which was, of course, a starting point of the NPR to establish basically how far the US side could go in terms of reductions in the proposed 10-year timeframe of the treaty. But as we've heard in the course of this morning's sessions, the prospects for moving quickly on a follow-on to the new START, including in relation to tactical nuclear weapons, appear to be far from rosy. In part, for its part, the Commission report identifies missile defense as a key stumbling block to further progress in reductions on strategic weapons, a viewpoint which is, of course, shared by Russia. So what the US and Russia are able to agree to in terms of the cooperation promised or foreshadowed in the NPR will, of course, be important for making headway for a START follow-on, new START follow-on. A very important focus of ICNND outreach activity in the US in advance of the NPR's release had been on declaratory policy on nuclear weapons use. The NPR clearly does not go as far as the Commission would have liked it to go, or as far as they'd like all nuclear weapon states to go, namely to achieve no first use policy, or at the very least as an interim gesture, a commitment to sole purpose. Nonetheless, the NPR does indicate an undertaking, as we discussed this morning, to work to establish conditions under which a sole purpose policy might be adopted in the future. This is obviously a very significant step, as is the contextualization of response contingencies that the NPR outlines to some extent, which replace an earlier commitment to or doctrine of strategic ambiguity. That said, of course, there are potential downsides to reduced reliance on nuclear weapons. Reference in the NPR to ongoing improvements in conventional response options may well complicate prospects for early early movement on follow-on talks, start follow-on talks. We heard this morning the Russian ambassador's concerns in this respect. The NPR's offer of revised negative security assurances accord with ICND preferences to make an exception only for those non-nuclear weapon states that are not in compliance with NPT obligations. The US strategy here obviously places more emphasis than the Commission on the broader strategic value of adherence to non-proliferation norms and to hold the line against Iran and DPRK. This is probably very important in relation to deconstructing the narrative of grievance that Iran's been able to disseminate, mainly in an armed context. But this is a narrative which seems to be a little bit less effective over recent months, obviously in the wake of the exposure of the Common Enrichment Facility and Iran's effective rejection of the Tehran research reactor deal. Other items, reducing the alert status of nuclear forces is clearly a point of difference between the Commission and the NPR, given the NPR has effectively maintained the status quo. Probably too arcane a debate for the likes of myself to enter into, but this will obviously be an issue that will continue to attract attention given the potentially catastrophic consequences of an accidental launch, something that the Commission report highlights to some extent. The NPR is undertaking to maintain the moratorium on testing and to not develop new nuclear warheads while encouraging, probably leave the Commission and broad international community still looking to more concrete progress towards US ratification of the CTBT. However challenging this prospect might be, and I think we're all aware of the problems on the Hill in relation to this, expectations are certainly running very high given that the administration continually restates its commitment to the CTBT. In addition to these more specific points and comparisons, worth looking at four broader points that I'd like to make, which relate mainly to the tone of points of intersection between the Commission and NPR. In the first instance, the language of the NPR marks a very clear point of departure from more technocratic predecessors, as does the fact that the finalization of the document appears to have been subject to an effectively unprecedented level of participation by the President. This is nowhere more apparent than in the fact that the NPR indicates a glide path towards achieving more ambitious goals than it can currently accommodate. What this all suggests is that the NPR is effectively an organic process. While no US administration will be bound by deadlines for achieving disarmament goals, as advocated in the Commission's non-prescriptive phased approach, the NPR's commitment to creating conditions for maximizing reductions during and beyond this 5 to 10 year time span is clearly a positive factor. In their statement, the Australian minister that I referred to earlier, the Australian Ministers for Foreign Affairs and Defence note the forward-looking approach of the NPR and acknowledge the NPR as a very substantial step towards a world without nuclear weapons. This leads directly to my second point, that the ICNND acknowledges the need to be sensitive to geopolitical circumstances in the pursuit of ambitious disarmament goals. The NPR goes some way towards contextualizing these goals in terms of how the US is reducing the role of nuclear weapons for deterrence purposes. Understanding the difficult international and domestic context in which the US must operate, and the increasingly constrained prerogatives that any administration has vis-à-vis allies and Congress, constitutes an important reality check for those advocating loftier disarmament goals. I might mention in this regard that large segments of the NGO community have indeed expressed consternation about what they see as the conservative nature of the ICNND report, which is perhaps a good advertisement for its practicality in some ways. Third, the US transparency and a growing sense of the responsibilities of allies are prompting a more sophisticated and responsible debate on extended deterrence. It's notable that senior US officials publicly commented on the fact that a more forward-leaning position on declaratory policy was held back by the concerns of some allies over the US's ability to field a sufficiently capable deterrent. The time has probably come now for this debate to be better informed by operational rather than political circumstances, which will be obviously the subject of the next panel. And the new strategic concept of NATO will provide the next opportunity perhaps to further redefine post-Cold War deterrence requirements. For its part, Australia has made no secret of its support for a reduced role for nuclear forces in national security strategies, and we're quite comfortable to see the US adopt a sole use policy, Obviously, the threat levels are different in each region between allies, but this is not an argument for defaulting to the status quo necessarily, especially given that US conventional response capabilities are becoming more sophisticated. Also, perhaps current and foreseeable threats, while unpredictable, are of a radically smaller order of magnitude than a massive Soviet nuclear attack in the Cold War era. Fourth and finally, the Commission and the NPR are spectacularly timely for having the maximum possible impact on this second chance to advance away from Cold War default positions on nuclear weapons. This timeliness has to be exploited by an approach that balances a transformational opportunity with the reality of uncertain strategic circumstances, as well as a clear acknowledgement of nuclear disarmament being a very long-term process. In conclusion, my own sense, if I could torture Leibniz a little, is that this is probably the best of possible NPRs given the circumstances. It's attentive to an era of unmatched uncertainty without compromising the more visionary aspects of the Prague Agenda. And certainly it amply demonstrates President Obama's personal commitment to changing how we think about nuclear weapons. Non-nuclear weapons states should not underestimate the entrenched default preferences of parts of the US system, nor should they shy away from helping the US create the conditions which might facilitate further movement from rhetoric to reality in achieving and implementing Prague speech goals. And the next opportunities we have for doing so, of course, are the NPT Review Conference and addressing non-compliance in the very obvious cases we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I think these two very excellent presentations provide some insight into what accolades and criticism the United States should expect on this nuclear posture review. And I think, Orlando, you put it very well, which is, this is, it's not the ambitious step that many people had hoped, both inside government and NGOs, but it is a step forward for most people. And I think, again, the real issue at stake in the weeks to come is public criticism that we hear, how much of that is a sustainable position versus a negotiating strategy for the review conference. So with that in mind, why don't we open up the floor for discussion. I'll ask that you just wait for a mic and let us know who you are and to whom your question is directed. So questions. And where are my mics? Sorry. Okay, great. So, sir, right here. Thank you.
My name is Bill Root. Is it in the security interest of either Brazil or Australia that the United States continue to renounce, not to renounce first use of nuclear weapons?
Great. You want to start, Peter?
Well, I mean, Australia is a close US ally, and we make no secret of the fact that we rely on extended deterrence efforts of the US in upholding our alliance relationship. How the US determines it needs to maintain a credible deterrent is a prerogative that we leave to the US. I mean, we obviously have strategic level discussions about threat and our regional environment, which is a tricky one, but we don't have any particular or publicly stated views other than the one that I referred to in relation to sole purpose. I mean, we would like, if the US wanted to go in the direction of sole purpose or no first use for that matter, we would be willing to discuss that along with other allies of the US to make sure that our concerns about the US fielding an adequate deterrent are met.
Great. Oh,
well, I'm just going to add that, I'm not in position to critique the American declaratory policy, but I would say that Brazil will welcome any declaratory policy that will help the goal of disarmament.
Okay, other questions? No questions. Well, I'm going to actually ask a follow-on then. And this is for either of you to respond to, but it was interesting to me that when Gary was talking about primary audiences and that the first was non-nuclear weapon state allies. And, he articulated this idea that extended deterrence from the United States is what is a key non-proliferation tool, I mean, in some ways, isn't that a real barrier to eventually getting towards disarmament if the idea is that we continue to need to protect these non-nuclear weapon state allies? And so what is then the responsibility of non-nuclear weapon states in trying to alleviate that condition in order to make disarmament more possible?
Well, just like non-nuclear weapon states are not a monolithic category, so are not U.S. allies. Frankly, when I referred to comments by U.S. officials in relation to concerns that allies raised with them about having an extensive approach to disarmament vis-à-vis deterrence, this highlights that fact, I think. We also have allies living in different threat environments. I mean, Australia perhaps is not as immediately affected by the possibility of a nuclear attack as other allies in Northeast Asia or potentially in Europe, with the possibilities that Iran the capabilities that Iran might feel down the track. So it's a very tricky issue, and that has to be balanced against, I suppose, the interesting project that James Acton is working on in relation to how you deal with a world where you have radically fewer nuclear weapons and how you maintain security assurances. These are all very, very tricky interrelated questions which I just don't feel qualified to answer because these are hard scenarios to envisage. But they're heavily interrelated, and I think the starting point must be increased transparency in the context of strategic talks that are not just bilateral, but to some extent trilateralized or plurilateralized. And I could think of, there are various cases. I mean, I don't know how politically feasible the possibility of having talks between India, Pakistan, and China might be, but there seems to be a very interesting security dynamic there that needs to be addressed, and doing that even at officials level in a confidential context might assist that process.
Okay, great. You, sir. And there's a microphone right there.
Andrew Pierre, Georgetown University. I'm going to ask Mr. Ribeiro a question, and I'm sure that you're not going to be able to draw on any Brazilian government statement to answer it, so this is kind of a personal question. You'll see why I'm putting it this way. Brazil is a country that has, in particular had in the past, a significant nuclear program. Argentina also. Brazil has a significant military industrial complex, if I can put it that way. If we look 10 years ahead, and you can choose 15 if you like, or you can choose 5 if you like, and you see a world where things have not gone well, so that there is a development of nuclear technology with possible military overtones, particularly in the Middle East Gulf context, which is the area most likely for that to happen. In your sort of theoretical and personal view, do you think this would have an impact on other non-Middle Eastern aligned countries, in particular on perhaps countries in Latin America? You mean for the development of nuclear weapons in, if we have a spread of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, Persian Gulf area, are we in a world where, for whatever reason, security, prestige, what have you, is that likely to have impact, for example, in your region?
Okay. Well, that's not a very good scenario. But I cannot speak by all countries in the region. What I can say is that, well, all countries are members of the Tlatelolco Agreement, so we are zone free of nuclear weapons. Brazil is bound by its constitution not to have nuclear weapons. We have an agreement with Argentina. We have also the four parties agreement with ABAC and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so I don't think we'll. It's very difficult to me to think Brazil going nuclear, or for the matter any other country in the region, and we hope also that your scenario regarding the Middle East never happens.
Pierce, right here. And then we'll go in the back.
Pierce Corden with the American Association for Advancement of Science. As the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference begins in a couple of weeks now, you're reacting to the NPR more generally, but specifically, you've both put it in the context of how to deal with issues there. Now, Iran will be there, and North Korea won't. And one of the reactions that we've heard about the NPR is that, well, it leaves open the prospect of nuclear weapon use against a party and a state that Gary Seymour says we would still legally and technically consider to be a party. How do you think this issue is going to be handled by non-aligned states or by non-nuclear weapon states at the NPT review conference, since both of those states are clearly not in compliance with obligations either against safeguards or the treaty itself? So how are you going to handle that? And the question's for both of you.
Not particularly, because I mean, I purposely steer away from multilateral diplomacy. I think it's tricky, obviously. Well, I mean, I'd like to hope. Well, for starters, I think that Iran will be problematic at the NPT review conference as a matter of course, whether or not a resolution is passed or however things pan out for it. I think I'd like to hope that its credibility for making mischief among NAM countries has been diminished because of recent events that I mentioned in my remarks. And I think in some ways, from what I understand, reading in the press, that the non-proliferation conference they had in Tehran backfired a little bit in terms of public statements by some of the participants. I mean, I'd have to assume that Iran will use the negative security assurances conditions, as stated in the NPR, to political effect by presenting itself as a victim that's being targeted, which is obviously not intellectually quite right in terms of what an NSA is. I'm not sure that they will necessarily get much political traction by exploiting that issue, frankly, because the NPT, I think, has been very wisely put in the NPR with a focus on creating, as Gary mentioned, incentives for coming into compliance with NPT obligations. And in a situation where Iran has been outed by the agency, obviously, and elsewhere, I think they'll have a harder case to build there to make mischief along these lines.
I'm going to comment on just on the Iranian issue. We have obviously a different view from the United States. We think that it's very hard to negotiate with Iran if you're still pressing for sanctions. There's a fundamental difference here. The U.S. thinks that we need more sanctions to draw the Iranians back to the negotiation table. We think that if there is new sanctions, that will draw the Iranians off the negotiation table. So that is why in my comments I said that there probably the way that Iran was it in the nuclear posture review should be perhaps worked out in order to facilitate an agreement.
Right, and Pierce, I'm happy to just also quickly respond on your two questions. One story I'll just share with you is that last week's conference in Tehran, it did, I think, actually backfire on the Iranians, where, from what I understand, they concluded the conference, but then they announced a 12-point communique as if it was something that had been agreed to by all the parties, and it wasn't. And you have countries like Singapore, which is a more reasonable and moderate member of the non-aligned movement, that publicly issued a press statement distancing themselves from the conference. And so I think that may have some ripple effects for how Iran is seen by other non-aligned movement countries at the review conference, because I think that's created a lot of bad feelings. I don't think it's probably been, this development hasn't been probably covered as well as it should have been by the press. And then just on the North Korean question, having them there at the review conference or not, let's remember what is the purpose of the review conference. It's to take a look back, see how well the provisions have been implemented, and then also to chart a path forward. My question is, what's the value of having the North Koreans there in this political climate? We're not going to solve their noncompliance at the review conference, so it's probably better for trying to find some common ground with countries that they're probably not there, or if they were there, that they probably remain silent. We had a question in the back, right there.
Rust. Just two questions, I guess, for Mr. Ribeiro. As a compliant party to the NPT, do you think that Brazil, in fact, is entitled to more benefits and so on than Iran is, for example, because Iran is in non-compliance? I sort of asked that sort of as a leading question because I think some of these policies that are in the NPR, particularly like the declaratory policy, is designed to make a distinction between those who are in compliance and those who are not. It doesn't necessarily suggest that the United States is about to nuke Iran, as I think we discussed earlier today. So I think that you have to recognize that some of this stuff is designed to recognize the kinds of commitments that countries like Brazil have made to be compliant with this treaty. So that's maybe just an observation more than anything else. But my question is that part of the NPR, of course, is designed to try to induce non-nuclear weapon states to be more forthcoming on important non-proliferation principles and measures, including the additional protocol. And as you know, Brazil has been one of the outliers on this for a long time. Brazil and Argentina, I believe, are the only two countries in the NPT with nuclear power programs that have not adopted the additional protocol, which I think most people here realize is recognized as one of the most important new measures that can be adopted to strengthen the NPT. I just wonder whether the kinds of more forthcoming policies on Article 6 that the new administration has identified is likely to have a positive impact on Brazil's attitude towards the additional protocol nationally, as well as maybe strong support for it at the review conference.
Well, on the first question, I think on Iran, I think we should look to the big picture. So what we want from Iran, we want to bring him back to NPT compliance. We want for Iran the same thing we have for Brazil. He may use the nuclear energy for peaceful purpose. The way we get there, that's the thing I mentioned, is different from the way the Americans see to get there. For instance, let's take the TRR proposal. We still think we can work on that. But we don't think that the TRR will resolve all the issues. It's just a building measure confidence. And we don't think sanctions or singling out Iran will help get us there. On our views, that will make the Iranians more non-responsive, and it will make us harder to achieve that. On the second part, I would just recall that Brazil was the 1998 adherence of Brazil to the NPT was based on the assumption that the nuclear weapon states would indeed adopt measures aiming at the complete elimination of atomic weapons. Have we had significant developments from 1998 to today? Well, as I mentioned, the NPR is a positive step, but it's not a huge step. So, I'm not speaking in the name of the Brazilian government, but I don't think particularly that will affect our view on the additional protocol.
Okay. Colonel Yao, right there, and then we'll go to James in the back.
My first question is to my Brazil colleague. Just want to ask you about the threat perception So,
Yeah.
okay. The threat perception of Brazil, before the NPR, did you, in your national security threat perception, do you think that U.S. use of nuclear weapons against Brazil is a real or authentic threat? Or if actually my question is, do you think it make any difference to your country's threat perception now that you are excluded actually from U.S. Possible U.S. military attack? And a second question to Peter, that's a follow-on question on the extended deterrence that United States provided to Australia. Your answer to that question seems to me that you imply on your part, you actually think that there's no much need for a nuclear component in the extended deterrence provided by the United States to your country. Because in Asia Pacific or in the Pacific area, the U.S. align mechanism is not like the NATO, it's bilateral. And so if your government just say that we don't want a nuclear component in the extended deterrence to my country, does that work? Or you just have to accept whatever the U.S. is going to provide you?
Well, as I mentioned, we welcome the new U.S. declaratory policy, but for Brazil, it didn't make any difference. We're not the target then, we're not the target now, and I hope we're not the target in the future.
Good, succinct answer. All right.
And the short answer to your question, Colonel, was simply that I think when we make reference to the extended deterrence, I mean, it's pitched in terms of extended nuclear deterrence against nuclear attack. I mean, and those circumstances are obviously ones that might come up in strategic level sort of threat discussions, but I think we're quite specific in relation to extended nuclear deterrence being in relation to nuclear attack. I mean, effectively, it almost implies a sole purpose policy, understanding. I mean, but as I said before, Australia would be comfortable with the US going towards a sole purpose policy in circumstances it determines with its allies are right.
But you will not feel uncomfortable if the United States is going to provide you with nuclear extended deterrence and it's not sole purpose. And one more follow-on question is that.
And actually, why don't you just say that again in the microphone so everybody can hear you? Sorry.
Okay, so I think your answer is that we would accept what is comfortable with the United States. If they want to provide us with extended deterrence with a nuclear component, we are going to accept it. But my question is that, do you feel do you really see any nuclear threat against your country that need a nuclear extended deterrence from United States to protect you?
Well, I mean, speaking personally, I mean, being informed by our regional security situation, not necessarily, no. But, I mean, Australia has traditionally pitched, and this is a question more for my defence colleagues and myself, and the subject of a recent white paper we did, pitched our defence profile in the region as being conscious of the fact that we're not a very populous country, a very large country geographically, and that we rely on a technology edge, as well as our very close relationship with the US. So that's the context.
Okay. Kim, could you get James the microphone? Thanks.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question on the issue of the additional protocol. The argument that you put forward, which I think is a very principled argument, is that the nuclear weapon states haven't lived up to their Article 6 obligations, which is something that a number of us at Carnegie have been arguing for a long time, and that as a result, the non-nuclear weapon states haven't been doing more. So let me put the question the other way round. What would it take from the weapon states for Brazil to ratify the additional protocol? How much more progress towards disarmament in concrete terms are you looking for before Brazil would feel that the weapon states had done enough to merit AP ratification?
Oh, that's a very difficult question to answer. But we've been a long time without any kind of progress. So I think that discussion we can start as long as we see some progress. As I mentioned today, even after the reductions are over, the United States and Russia will still account for more than 90% of the world stockpile. So still a huge amount. I don't think, and as I mentioned also, during all those years, we, the non-nuclear weapon state, kept our side of the bargain with the exception of one country. So if you put that on the balance, you'll still have to progress a little bit more in order for us to have that conversation. I don't think that will happen in this NPT review.
Great. And then Alex, if you could give it to that gentleman right there.
Good afternoon. My name's Andrew Reedy. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. And my question relates to sort of the atmosphere surrounding the NPT and the upcoming NPT review conference. From the panelists today, I almost get this perception that there's sort of an adversarial, a tit for tat, you do this, I do that. Is there a recognition or maybe a dialogue taking place among non-nuclear weapon states of maybe a cooperative effort, leading countries, Brazil being one of them, that we could take the lead in ratifying the additional protocol, sort of take charge, set the example, such as President Obama laid out in the Prague Agenda? You know, we're looking to take the lead as the United States is in achieving this common goal, because it is in fact a common goal. So what's the dialogue on that? Instead of an adversarial context, more of a cooperative leading type atmosphere. Thank you.
Well, we don't see it as an adversarial dialogue. We, as I mentioned, we welcome President Obama's speech, the nuclear posture review, which is not a legally binding document. So I guess that what I was trying to say is that we need to see more progress on the part of the nuclear weapon states in order to start talking about more commitments to non-nuclear weapon states. We don't see why we should defend the necessity of the additional protocol, since at Brazil, for instance, we are members of, as I mentioned, the Tata Local Agreement, the Four Parties Agreement. We have it in the Constitution. So we don't see the need for new measures.
Okay, Zia, all the way in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious if both of our panelists could say a few words about what they think about the balance in the nuclear posture review between this declaratory policy and this talk of creating the conditions for further talks with Russia and China and moving towards a nuclear weapons-free world on the one hand, and the very concrete, detailed, timelined, funded items in the nuclear posture review about the modernization of the US nuclear weapons arsenal, production complex, and nuclear weapons laboratories. Because one of the things that comes across most clearly in the posture review is that the Obama administration's vision of a nuclear weapons-free world includes retaining nuclear weapons laboratories as a potential breakout capacity in a world free of nuclear weapons. And I'm just wondering what you think of that as the path between here and this notion of nuclear disarmament.
Peter, do you want to start?
Well, I think it's probably colored by the domestic circumstances in the US. Certainly I read the speech made by Vice President Biden and the budget proposal as being one way of approaching, CTBT ratification. One of the main hang-ups seemed to be reliability of the stockpile. So they've approached it by making a long-term commitment to the infrastructure. Now, this is going to be a very tricky issue. It's going to be very tricky to balance expectations on the Hill with concrete disarmament gestures that have some sort of multilateral currency. It's just a very difficult problematic. And on the earlier part of your question, the context, where there's a good balance between declaratory policy and how this might evolve over time, well, I mean, I think that depends on geopolitical circumstances referred to in very oblique terms, because there's a very broad dynamic at work here. We certainly discussed this morning the context of negotiations for a follow-on to the New START will be difficult, because you have to have a more complex, more comprehensive approach that asks the hard questions. And I can imagine that in advance of any such talks and negotiations, you're looking at, medium-term, short to medium-term strategic stability talks before you can even embark on a negotiation on further reductions. So the budget proposals on infrastructure, coming back for a moment, I think in some ways that also is obviously the easiest part of this whole debate to address domestically, because it creates it's the best beachhead you have for creating a non-partisan space in Congress to start informing the debate on CTBT ratification down the track. And we've already heard about some of the hurdles that might well be facing START ratification by perhaps more conservative members on the Hill.
Just going to add one thing. I think the nuclear policy review reflects the way it was built, with inputs from many sectors. This morning, when Mr. Seymour was starting his speech, and he said that the nuclear policy review was designed for different audience, that he was trying to accommodate views and interests. My first thought that he was going to mention the views of the Senate, the views of the non-proliferators, the think tanks. So, because this document it's different from the other ones, because this one has input from many areas. So that might explain why you have what you mentioned.
One point. The NPR has a 5 to 10 year time frame. Nuclear disarmament has a much longer time frame, as the President keeps alluding to. And it's very important, I think, in this NPR, and I mentioned that in my remarks, that it shows a glide path towards loftier Prague Agenda objectives. And I think it does show that. I mean, obviously it sets conditions for the circumstances being right. But there is a sort of a game plan that has to be, that's a very broad and outline, but it'll be filled in over time. But I think while it has a very specific time frame in terms of its realistic, what we can do now, it also has a glide path for more thoroughgoing, more forward-leaning positions as circumstances develop.
Any other questions? Right here up front, Alex, if you could give it to this gentleman in the third row.
Alan Boyer from Defense Group. The NPR talks a lot about one of the ways or means to execute its goals is through regional deterrent architectures. And that reaches back to the QDR. So one of the key means to achieve the objectives in the NPR and move forward is through these architectures. But when you look at the nature of the difficulties that have been talked about, and I'll go to the Iranian one. If you look at the nature of the Iranian regime and what they say, if you really believe that they're going to do what they say, an example is the monograph that Carnegie's put out on Hatami, for example, as a good case in point. In my estimate, that at the end of the day, the value of the political optic for the Iranians in terms of the nuclear program is so high that there's nothing the U.S. or anybody else can do to get them to change course. So they're going to get a nuclear weapon or get a virtual nuclear weapon capability. So in reference to that means, how useful do you see these architectures as a useful means of dealing with this likely outcome, which I would say is probability is higher than not?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky question. I mean, there are regions that are inherently unstable because they don't have collective security arrangements. The Asia Pacific being a case in point, Middle East. It's kind. I suppose it's very hard. It's hard to speculate about Iranian intentions. I mean, we can go on the basis of behavior and look at response options, but I don't think there are very many good options, frankly. Looking at how Iran's asserting itself regionally. this administration has been attentive, as Gary mentioned in his comments this morning, to cultivating understandings, implicit understandings with partners in the region, and doing that to some extent demonstratively as a deterrent effect against Iran. But I think you're right. It's hard to assess Iran denying itself at least a breakout capability. It's also very hard to read Iran strategically. I mean, you have a leadership that's in which decision-making processes aren't very clear. It's very hard to get a sense of where Iran sees itself strategically down the track and what steps it's going to take to achieve that end. And there's just so much opaqueness there. So I don't know. I think it's just a very tricky dynamic. I couldn't comment on any further than that.
Well, I would just offer to the scenario that you've laid out is that I think the purpose, one of the things the administration might argue is that the purpose of a regional security arrangement for that scenario is what is the effect of Iran on Iran's neighbors, and how do we keep them from feeling that they need to develop a nuclear weapons capability or actual weapons themselves, and so I think that's been part of the focus too. It's what's Iran going to do, and then what's the follow-on effect.
Well, I mean, it's the logic of the architectures, the idea that you form these regional deterrent architectures. Is that a sound means? Yeah. I guess is what those.
Yeah.
I mean, part of this is if you have a lofty goals, or here's where we want to go. Well, you have to affect means and ways to do that. And so one of the ways and means dealing with uncertainty and challenges is, and they come out and say, hey, we're going to do these regional deterrent architectures. So the question in terms is that strategically sound or not sound, I guess is a question from your perspectives. I mean, when you look back from different parts of the world, does that seem like a reasonable approach that will help advance the agenda down the road? And that's an interesting question what Brazil has to say on that too, because it's a way that could be applied in different ways in different parts of the world, or it could be considered stabilizing or not stabilizing. But at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of way to go forward to deal with those kind of challenges.
Okay, great. Why don't we go right here, and then we'll take those two questions, and then that's probably all I'll have time for.
Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. For Orlando Ribeiro, my question, concerning what you said about the additional protocol, hypothetical question. Perhaps you think maybe it would have been a good idea if Brazil had withheld its constitutional, including abolition of nuclear weapons its prohibition on nuclear weapons in its constitution, or even signing the Treaty of Tlatelolco, withheld these until there's some evidence that the weapon states were pursuing disarmament. Well, it's a hypothetical. Perhaps you think, I just want to extend your attitude towards the additional protocol. You're saying, I said, you don't want to sign the additional protocol, and there's some evidence of disarmament from the weapon states, if I got you correctly. So perhaps you can extend that a little further. Hypothetically, perhaps Brazil should not have instituted a constitutional prohibition of nuclear weapons, or even Brazil should not have signed the Treaty of Tlatelolco until there's evidence of disarmament by the weapon states.
In a nutshell, is it, would Brazil have had more leverage today if it hadn't taken those steps in trying to get disarmament?
Well, again, we don't have any technical problems with the additional protocol. If there was a political decision to sign it, we would comply with no problem. But the fact is that when we acceded to the NPT, we had in that decree saying that Brazil would only, because at that time we already had the Tlatelolco, already had the agreements with the Argentinians. So at that time the decree said, okay, now you're a member of the NPT. So further steps we would only be allowed or considered if there is improvement, disarmament, the advancement in the disarmament. So that was it. We don't have any technical problems, but we need to comply by the decree that of the NPT.
And the scenario that you've actually, painted for us is actually the Egyptian strategy. They're not going to sign or take on any additional obligations, and they say this themselves that they haven't done so since 1981 until they get some of the things that they're really looking for on the disarmament path. So I think we can look at that case study and see whether that strategy is really effective or not. So we're going to take Carl and then Stephen as our last two questions together, and then I'll ask the panelists to conclude.
Thanks. Carl Robichaux, Carnegie Corporation of New York. My question, I suppose, is the United States, and the president in particular, he spent a lot of political capital in the past year, or invested a lot of political capital to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the defense posture of the United States. And this has been a big struggle within his administration, starting with the Prague speech and subsequently the Nuclear Posture Review. And has done so partially on the premise, as Gary Seymour outlined earlier, that some of these audiences, in particular non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT, would see this as an important step of U.S. compliance with its international commitments. My sense from what we heard from Deepti earlier is that we're going to see at this upcoming review conference a lot of opposition and rigidity towards any further non-proliferation steps. And my concern is that within the U.S. political debate, as the president and his advisors have sought to justify investing this political capital to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. defense policy, that they may have staked too much on this review conference. And I think we're not likely to see a smashing success at this review conference, to put it mildly. So how does that affect the debate down the line, both in the U.S. from your perspective and also in your respective countries? And what can be done outside of these review conferences, which are really mileposts rather than places where a lot of the actual hard work is getting done? So if you could just give some context on that, that would be very helpful.
Great. And then, Stephen, if you could give us our
Sure,
last question.
I'll be brief. Thank you. Stephen Schwartz, James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Question for both panelists, but maybe primarily Mr. Ribeiro. Following up on James, who's not here anymore, a question on how much progress is enough progress. It strikes me that this is kind of a moving target. If you go and look back at where the United States and Russia were with their nuclear weapons 20 years ago as the Cold War was winding down, they had more than twice as many weapons as we have today. So progress, there is progress. I think the problem that the United States and Russia face in trying to convince the non-aligned movement and the rest of the world is that they were and still are sitting on piles and piles and piles and piles of weapons, and until very recently did not take any steps with regard to reducing those weapons or changing their status, and mention it in the context of Article 6. Only in retrospect, really during the Bush administration, did this start. So I'm not going to act as an apologist for the United States, but clearly we're in a much better position in the numbers of weapons today than we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I mean, operationally, we have far fewer weapons than we've had in decades. So I guess my question is, when we talk about progress, are you talking about sheer numbers of weapons? Are you talking about global percentages of weapons? Is it only when the United States and Russia get down to the levels of the United Kingdom, France, and China that you will, I won't ask you to speak for the rest of the world, but you would personally consider that we, the United States, have done enough? I mean, what is it? How low do we have to go before this becomes acceptable and we can move forward with the rest of the agenda?
Great. Well, I'm cognizant that those questions are standing in the way of lunch, so I'll ask Orlando and Peter to quickly respond.
Well, we had the Prague speech. We had the signing of the START agreement. But so far, there was no the ratification of neither the START agreement nor the CTBT. We don't know if this is going to be a walk in the park or if the American government is going to have some problems in the Senate. So I don't think we could measure the by the reduction of the numbers of weapons. I think we would be very happy to see those points that I just mentioned advance. That will be, because you have to keep in mind that the Prague speech, although was a very important moment, and the NPR also it's not a legally binding document. So nothing provides the president from tomorrow taking some decision that is not in accordance to the NPR. So I don't think we can say at this point. Again, I don't want to look pessimist. I think we welcome the NPR. It's a positive step. I think the world has changed. Obama has set a very important agenda in Prague. But I think we need to see some real developments. It's been, 10 years since the CTBT it's in Congress.
Okay, Peter.
Well, I agree with Steve. I think what's been achieved on the disarmament side has been quite monumental. And I think in some ways perhaps the previous administration wasn't as effective as it might have been in touting that in multilateral contexts. And I think it's very important to do that in a more complex way, as this administration is doing very efficiently in terms of the timeliness of all the various things that are happening, the nuclear security, some of the NPR, the Prague speech, the New START treaty, and giving an ideological context or doctrinal context for what this administration is trying to achieve. It's not just about numbers, because we've seen that does not work. Having said all that, I mean, we have to ask ourselves what the priority is now. I mean, is disarmament more urgent than non-proliferation now in 2010? Certainly not. I mean, we have a post-Cold War situation where the possibility of massive nuclear attacks is highly remote. We have radically fewer nuclear weapons, and we have a path for further negotiations. The contingency of nuclear attack between states has receded entirely. Nobody's objecting to the highlighting or prioritizing very intelligently by this administration of nuclear terrorism and proliferation to unstable states. Just related to the extended deterrence question before, I mean, in some ways extended deterrence has worked because it was basically first world countries that could produce nuclear weapons, and they spoke the same. They were like-minded. They didn't feel any obligation given they had extended deterrence. Now we're looking at less developed countries making these weapons. So that's the concern. I mean, we have to talk about the non-compliance. I mean, that's the main priority here. The NPT sure has to find balance between the three pillars, but it is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and we've got some hard cases here that are not analogous to each other. The Iranian case is very difficult. I mean, it's a diverse, relatively sophisticated economy. It has strategic ambitions in its regions, perhaps more broadly, and it sets a nasty precedent. So that's where the focus should be. And I question, what is enough? I mean, in terms of disarmament gestures, one nuclear weapon is too much, obviously, but even getting to a few hundred is strategically very difficult and impossible to conceive. And I know there's a lot of work in the think tank community here to try and imagine how we deal with that. But just even thinking about the verification provisions for a scenario like that is just mind-boggling. And related to that, in relation to the first question on the expectations on the NPT review conference, I don't think anybody has very ambitious expectations of a review conference these days. The pessimists will say, well, a success will be if it's not a train wreck. And other people will say the success would be a consensus document, and which will obviously be very, very bland. Well, I don't know. I don't think this administration is obviously holding a lot of store by the NPT, because everything it does on non-proliferation is done in the broader picture of tightening global non-proliferation norms. And the NPT is, of course, the cornerstone there, but it's also a victim of its consensus arrangements. So I think putting the NPT not in a holding pattern, but as a fixed cornerstone of the global non-proliferation regime, at least rhetorically, is important. But I don't think this administration sees that as a be all and end all, as does not I imagine, Australia and other countries, because we have to work in other contexts beyond the RevCon. One of the ambitions will obviously be strengthening or better resourcing the IAEA. Certainly a very strong message that came out of the Nuclear Security Summit. I mean, that's something that's, it's very relevant. So I think we need to look beyond that. Now, in terms of the political capital that's been extended here, I mean, it's probably my youth colleagues are better qualified to talk about this than me, but my impression is that I don't know if the RevCon is really looked at very closely among legislators here at all. I mean, they're very focused on the domestic aspects, informing their perception of any compromise in national security with the new START Treaty and CTBT. And we've already seen some conflation of the debate on modernization with new START ratification. So I don't know if the RevCon is really an issue, frankly. I mean, certainly in the CTBT ratification context, I suppose some legislators are asking whether U.S. signing is worth it, ratification is worth it because it won't enter into force anyway. So I think those are more prominent issues, frankly.
Great, thank you. And, Carl, the other thing I would just say to your question is the only thing that's massively changed since 2005 is kind of what's happened in the last year. And we have to remember the review conference isn't just about what the United States does. There's responsibility from other nuclear weapon states to show some leadership. And I think there are questions about whether that's really in play right now. And what I would say to non-nuclear weapon states who want to support further disarmament measures is that they can take steps to bolster the effort in nuclear weapon states to do that, because it would show some evidence that that political capital was worth expending. With that, thank you so much for your patience and great questions. And to our two panelists, please join me in thanking them.